Hey everybody, welcome to Disarming Leviathan. My name is Caleb. This podcast is designed to equip you to engage American Christian nationalists as a mission field. Today, I talk with author and scholar Robert P. Jones, who's the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and is a leading scholar and commentator on both religion and politics. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, religion, and other topics for the Atlantic, Time, and Religious News Service. He is frequently featured in major national media such as MSNBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Disarming Leviathan podcast. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master's of Divinity from the venerable Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author of books like White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and The End of White Christian America. He's also recently published a new book called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, which helps us understand how historic issues of race, supremacy, and power dynamics shape the modern American Christian nationalist movement. I believe that this interview will help give us a broader understanding of how we got to where we're at today and how we can address it as faithful followers of Jesus. So without further ado, here's my interview with Robert P. Jones. Robert, in your book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, The Path to a Shared American Future, you talk about this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. You mentioned that it's like a Rosetta Stone for understanding our nation's story, even some of the deep stories in Europe, political thought, and religious worldviews. What is the Doctrine of Discovery, and help us understand how it's like a Rosetta Stone?
All right. Well, we're going to jump right to it, it sounds like. Great. Well, thanks for having me on, first of all, and for the conversation. When you hear the Doctrine of Discovery, it sounds very heady and formal and all that. And of course, it was actually, like its specific definition is a set of doctrines that was developed in the Western Christian Church, and they were way back there in the 15th century. Now, it's important to understand, why, whenever we have doctrines that develop, they're usually developing in response to a set of problems that the church is encountering. And so what's going on, right, in the 15th century? Well, it is the way we were taught about it, it's the great age of quote-unquote discovery that's happening, right, with Europeans who are encountering all these people that they didn't, and lands that they didn't know existed. And so that raised political problems, it raised moral questions, and it raised theological questions. And so who do they look to? They look to the head of the Western Christian Church at the time, which was the Pope. So just to clarify, there were no Protestants in the world at this point in time, right? That doesn't happen until the end of the 1500s. There's also no Church of England at this time, right? So all of Western Europe is Catholic. It is, and so the Pope in Rome is the head of the Western Catholic Church, and it's also kind of the closest thing to kind of a international moral authority and international law that existed at the time. So there was a really question put by Christian kings and queens to the church and said, look, what's our moral and religious responsibility toward these people that we're encountering here? Because this is something new. We don't really have a theology for this. And over a course of, about half a century, from 1452 to 1493, there's a set of doctrines that get issued, and they get issued by a number of popes in these official opinions called papal bulls. And that collection of those things is what's collectively known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And so while they're written in Latin and they're formal theological documents, they actually boil down to something quite simple. At the end of the day. And by the way, if your readers want to go read, or your listeners want to go read them, there's actually a website called doctrineofdiscovery.org where you can actually read them. If you're a classics person, you can read them in Latin, or they're translated into English as well if you want to kind of read them for yourselves. But they essentially, with a lot of formal theological structure, boil down to this: the kind of defining question that determined whether or not these people, newly discovered from the European perspective, had any human rights that were bound to be respected, was essentially one question. And that question was, are they Christian? And if the answer to that was no, then the doctrines go on to basically just give permission to European Christians to occupy their land, to steal their goods. And if they resist, to either kill or enslave them. And, and they're not kind of subtle about this. Like, one of the documents, in fact, says that European Christians have the right to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, right? That's in the document from the hand of the head of the, Western Christian Church at the time. So, if we think about, the version of Christianity that just lands on the shores of the Americas, it's animated by this idea. All right, the superiority of Christianity, the superiority of Europeans to everyone in the world, with the blessing of the church and the power of the state to conquer, to kill, and to enslave.
So in America, we have this story of 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He lands in the Americas. He discovers, is the language that I remember learning as a kid. He discovers the Americas, but he also discovers people here, thus muddying the waters of what it means to discover. And what I'm understanding you to be saying is that this created a dilemma of what do we do? Can we take this property for ourselves or not? Because as Christians, we don't steal, we don't do murder and stuff like that. So there's this economic motivation, as well as moral. Like, did Columbus create the need for the Doctrine of Discovery?
Yeah. Well, Columbus was actually kind of late on the scene. I mean, the first one of these gets issued in 1452, right? So a good 40 years before Columbus sails the ocean blue, as we learn about. And the last one the last papal edict that's most relevant is called Inter Caetera in Latin, but it was issued in 1493. Right. And Columbus did precipitate that one. And what's significant about 1493? Well, it's the year he goes back after being here. And by the way, just for our American listeners, he doesn't arrive in any of the within the borders of what we call the United States ever. Right. So he never sets foot on what we think of today as American soil. It's Hispaniola, it's in the Caribbean, but never in the kind of what we think of as the mainland United States today. But he goes back, and that's when he appeals to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, those names we typically know from American history. But he asks them for more ships, more soldiers, more missionaries, and then he asks the church for this moral mandate, backed up by a kind of new theology for the quote unquote new world.
So that's a bunch of European stuff. But Robbie, I'm an American. So how has this European Catholic thing, the Doctrine of Discovery, how has that influenced the American story and how we think of things like westward expansion? So I live in Arizona. It wasn't Arizona 120 years ago. It was something else.
Yeah.
How have you seen Doctrine of Discovery influence America's story and history?
Yeah, well, it sets up really the entire words that we have to describe this thing. Like we talk about manifest destiny, a new Zion, like those kind of language that also kind of tells us that it is in fact a kind of religious, like that language, new Zion, right, is straight out of the Bible, right? And so it's mapping this conquest, this kind of biblical conquest onto the new continent. Even things that sound sort of benign, like a city set on a hill from John Winthrop, for example, the early, British colonies. Turns out that, if you would ask the Native Americans at the time that lived near Winthrop what they felt about a city set on a hill, I mean, it really did mean death and disease for them. Violent death at the hands of Winthrop and the other colonizers there, and also disease that was spread from Europeans into indigenous people as well. So these, we've kind of developed a benign set of euphemisms, pioneers, these kind of, like I said, manifest destiny, to really describe what really is a very violent conquest and colonizing, right, of an already occupied land. And then it was justified, really in the name of, these people were called, in really bellicose language, again, in these documents of the Doctrine of Discovery, if they were not Christian, they were referred to as quote unquote enemies of Christ, right? This very bellicose language that again kind of set people up in this oppositional, violent stance toward indigenous people.
So we have in our national imagination, like the Oregon Trail, cowboy movies, Dances with Wolves. Underneath all that is this idea that it's justifiable, religiously justifiable, to take the property because the people are enemies of Christ. Am I catching that right?
Yeah, that's right. And as such had no rights to the land. And, this isn't just it's the theology, the Christian theology that undergirds it with a kind of moral strength, but it also gets incorporated into U.S. law. Johnson v. McIntosh in the early 1800s was a precursor to what came to be known in American history as Indian removal, right? This kind of policy of the federal government of pushing indigenous people off their lands. In the 1830s, it was mostly concentrated on moving large numbers, tens of thousands of indigenous people out of the Southeast west across the Mississippi River to places like Oklahoma, and they end up in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico as well. And so it was that, but then it just kept pushing, right? It kept pushing westward. And so, as we get statehood later in the Western states than we do in the Eastern states, but all the creation of those states, right, were about putting European boundaries around what was, and in many cases, was promised to forever be indigenous land.
So you mentioned that some of these ideas were codified in our laws, even maybe in our founding documents. How might our founding documents have been influenced by this?
Yeah, so I had all this, religious history, but I never really scrutinized how this shows up, even in our founding documents. We're quite rightly proud of the Declaration of Independence and for the principles, right, of freedom, equality, that are kind of throughout that document. But if you read the whole thing, you kind of get midway down and there's a whole passage describing indigenous people as merciless savages, right? And one of the grievances, actually two of the grievances that are espoused against the King of England in the Declaration of Independence have to do with enslaved Africans and indigenous people, right? So one of the things is the king is not allowing the colonists to expand beyond the west of the Appalachian Mountains, where the colonists want to go, because the king has actually reserved those lands for indigenous people. And they're complaining about that. And then they're also complaining that the king is allowing slave rebellions among them. Like, that's all in the Declaration of Independence, along with these higher principles. We get to the Constitution, even there, right? It explicitly excludes Indians in the document, even from the Bill of Rights and whenever it's talking about the rights of citizens. It also famously excludes women and counts, African Americans as 3/5 of a person, right? And then only for the empowering whites in the states in which they live. They can't vote themselves, but whites get basically themselves plus 3/5 of the African Americans who live in their jurisdictions to empower them politically. So I think we forget that, like, it's just all mixed up together, right? And I think that's one of the challenges, even for our day, is that we have these two traditions, a kind of proud democratic pluralism, that is, no matter what your race, no matter what your religion, you stand on equal footing before the Constitution and on equal footing with all other citizens. That's a very proud tradition. And then we have this other competing tradition that has been with us from the beginning and is still with us today, that claims that America is a kind of promised land for European Christians and everybody else is second-class citizens.
So we've covered the 1400s all the way into the 1800s. And for many of us, that's in our imagination. It's just what we learned in history. It's the movies we've seen. It's the stories we tell ourselves. How do you see the Doctrine of Discovery manifesting itself today in our national conversations or our national imagination?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing for, just our imaginations is that I think we've dulled our imaginations even to the things that are right in front of us, right? And I think it's particularly true for, Western states. You're in Arizona, but like, if you think about just the names on the map, right? Tucson, Phoenix. There's also Navajo reservations, right? And something like Fort Apache reservation, even, right? What is that about? And so if you start unpacking, those histories, it's right there in front of us, that it still exists, rivers, mountains, it's all right there. County names testify to the history that we try to kind of hold at bay, but it's right there, I think, in front of us. But it's also quite present in our current political conflicts. One of the really striking things that I note in the book is that you can actually measure the continued influence of these, again, like 15th century, 500-year-old documents in American attitudes today. So we asked on a public opinion survey this year in 2023, do you think that that America was destined by God to be a promised land for European Christians, where they could set an example for the rest of the world? And 3 in 10 Americans agree with that statement. And you could say 2/3 of Americans reject it, but it's still a sizable minority of Americans that agree with it. And here's the kicker, though, is that those they're not evenly distributed across our political space, right? That 30% is disproportionately white evangelical and Republican. So a majority of Republicans and a majority of white evangelicals today agree with that statement. That's who America is and who America is for, right? Is European Christians, and that's something that was designated by God. And you could draw a straight line from that sentiment straight back to the 500 years of Christian theology that landed on these shores.
Yeah, and many of the American Christian nationalist circles that I've listened to or been a part of, you will hear people like Columbus, people like the founders, lauded, elevated, celebrated as great, the words you use, great pioneers, great men of industry and geniuses who, made America great. And somewhere, at least in their imagination, we've lost that greatness. The undertone is it's no longer Protestant European descendants having all the power. And that's kind of the thing that we're missing. And so phrases like "make America great again" seem to be this toxic nostalgia, distorted nostalgia that looks back on a imagined era of great prosperity. Usually the image is white, upper middle class, people in suits and ties wearing cross necklaces and whatnot. And so we certainly see it, even though it's not pronounced. Doctrine of Discovery doesn't get used by Christian nationalists in America. Manifest destiny is not a phrase that usually gets thrown around, but these ideas are certainly the baseline of many of the American Christian nationalists that we encounter. Thinking about, like, on the ground now, like at the dinner table, how might words or phrases or ideas that some of our friends, family, coworkers are, when they're talking to us, what can we be listening for in their talk track, and maybe tether that to Doctrine of Discovery?
Yeah. Well, look, as you know, I mean, I'm from the South. I grew up in Mississippi. I grew up white evangelical, a Southern Baptist, in Mississippi. And my family has been Baptist in the South for 6 generations, right? So I know of which you speak, and friends and family. I think it shows up most frequently in the kind of really common claim that America is a Christian nation. Like, that's the kind of vernacular, I think, of the most common expression. But, it's always, I think, if you just kind of like slow it down, unpack it, what do you mean by that? What historically do you mean by that? And then, like, what's the implication of that today? Do you really mean that, our friend down the street who's Baha'i or our friend down the street who's Jewish doesn't have the same rights that we do? Like, is that really what you mean? What's the implications of making that claim? But I think you're right about that nostalgia, and as you said, toxic nostalgia, and that word again is really where all the power is. It's always worth asking that too. When is the again, right? When are we talking about? Because they're not talking about 1490 when America was great, right? When it was fledgling little colonies, or not even colonies, but fledgling little European incursions. They're not talking about 1619 when they're very vulnerable British colonies kind of clinging to the shores and clinging for survival in the country. So when are we talking about, and it often, as you say, I think it often is kind of a version of, 1950s America, somewhere before Brown v. Board of Education, when we still have segregated schools and Jim Crow in the South. And there's just a clear hierarchy. And I think that is what's often being invoked, is a hierarchical claim. And that at the root of it, that really is what the Doctrine of Discovery is claiming, is that there is a divinely ordained hierarchy in the world, right? And it is Christians over everyone else. It is people of European descent over everyone else. And frankly, it's men over women in that vision, as well. And everybody has been created to be in their place and should stay in their place, right? Is the vision of that. And so, it's worth is that really what we believe? Is that really what we're, and so I think trying to kind of have a conversation with probing questions that is like about just trying to get the quiet part to be said out loud, I think is part of the way of having, some discussion that doesn't just devolve into a shouting match at the end of the day.
Yeah, we've got this desire, this really good desire for belonging and safety. And when I imagine what it might have been like in the 1950s, in Eisenhower's America, if I can project onto that my desires of safety, belonging, everything as it should be, white picket fences, food on the table, dad at work, mom taking care of kids. But we forget ourselves because the 1950s was horrible for almost everybody. Even the people that we're imagining ourselves to be. You had this rising tension, the nuclear threat with the USSR. Children in that era were doing atomic bomb drills under their desk at school. That's terrifying. And
the poverty rate for seniors was off the charts because it's before Social Security.
Yeah, and spousal abuse was sky high. Many of the things that we say today are increasing did exist. They just didn't talk about it. So divorces were quiet, spousal abuse was quiet, infidelity was rampant but quiet. We didn't have Twitter. So all that to say that when we're talking with folks, the desire is good to belong, to be safe, to flourish within a community. But the answer is broken because it's projecting those desires onto an idealized past that never actually existed. And Robbie, as you said, especially for people of color, for indigenous peoples, for anyone who wasn't a white dude, a wealthy or middle-class white dude, it was pretty miserable. And it's not to say that we don't have problems today, but the desire is good. And I think for those of us encountering this rhetoric, this American Christian nationalist rhetoric, or even political commitments at the dinner table, at the workplace, Robbie, I love what you're saying, helping them to see what's underneath that statement and that desire, and then asking, how do we get back to that? How do we accomplish those desires? Are we really saying we want to segregate society or kick out people who are not Christians? Is that what we're saying? Just to help, again, say the quiet part out loud, because it may be that our conversation partners are just repeating rhetoric that they've been hearing over and over again. Yeah. And it's a borrowed conviction. It's not a deeply held conviction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think that there's a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric, right? Like that this is the end of America. This is the end of the world as we know it. And there's a way in which it's not completely untrue. If you think that the world that they're talking about is a kind of white supremacist world, right, where, particularly white, straight Christian men, kind of have the road open up before them and everybody else has to kind of scramble. It is true. But that's not a world we should be striving to hold on to, at the end of the day. And so I think being willing to sort of like say, okay, yeah, that initial fear we feel about that, those of us who are white and Christian, is not coming from nowhere, right? The world is changing. The country is changing, right? And white Christians are, in fact, only 42% of the country today, right? That takes some getting used to if you're used to being a supermajority in the country. But, it doesn't have to be like a cliff we're about to walk over, right? It can be a transition. And in many ways, we can look for the promise of giving us an opportunity to reclaim, some of those higher principles in those founding documents we're so proud of kind of quoting, but things like equality, fraternity, right? Liberty for everyone, not just for the privileged few. Those are things we can all get behind. And I think in some ways, the demographic changes are calling us to account for whether we ever really meant it when we espouse support for those principles, or if we only meant it when it was mostly benefiting people who look like us.
Yeah, and also as followers of Jesus, we're called to weep with those who weep, to mourn with those who mourn. And there really is something being lost. In the lived experience of many who hold to American Christian nationalism, they feel the sadness and pain of a lack of familiarity with their own community. I've been with people who have said, I used to be that I could safely walk down the street to the grocery store, and now that's over. Well, there's maybe all sorts of reasons why that's happening. They may be ascribing that to, the wrong, they may be diagnosing it incorrectly, but the pain is real. What used to feel familiar and safe is now does not feel familiar or safe. And that causes us fear and anxiety, which is being leveraged by a lot of Christian nationalist leaders for power and money. But at the dinner table, at the workplace, we can connect with people around that fear. America isn't what it used to be. Well, I feel that too. My neighborhood's changing, my community's changing. But as followers of Jesus, how can we enter into that change without being led by fear? And that may be a space in which we can invite people to take a look at what is causing the fear, and then how does Jesus speak to that? Robbie,
amen to that. Yeah.
You've done a lot of work in research, and you kind of got your finger on the pulse of how Americans or American evangelicals are shifting and what their political commitments are. As you think about specifically the evangelical church in America, how would you encourage the church collectively, those in the pews and those in the pulpits, to move forward in a healthy way?
Wow. Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, when I've been asked, so why are you writing all these books with the word white and Christian in the titles? This is the third one I've written on this topic over the last 10 years. And I think it's because I just continue to wrestle, with it. And I continue to see the church, predominantly white churches wrestling, with it. It is going to be, I think, a multi-generational effort at the end of the day. We're not going to solve 400 years of problems in a single generation, nor should we expect to. But I think we've got really important work to do. And I think this generation can really be the one, I think, that can break the chain, right? And they can actually be aware of things that I think were so easy to be blind to in previous generations. There's a way in which, I don't know, people living in those kind of white Christian suburban bubbles in the 1950s and 60s could kind of just stay there, right? But I think there's no the accountability, I think, for white Christians today is there. Like, there's no white Christian today that can possibly live in that kind of a bubble. And so, we're responsible for what we see. But I do think the promise really is not just a kind of, beating ourselves up, but, if you kind of take seriously this trajectory, that if we did allow the politics of empire and violence to take over Christian theology, right? Or we allow Christian theology to be in the service of those things, that gives us something actually really important to do, right? Is to disentangle it from those efforts. And that's like a noble thing to be proud of, right? If we're working in that vein. And it's a gift to our children and our children's children to be working in that vein. So I think we just kind of take a beat, take a breath, right? And realize that, actually the discipleship might actually consist of more than going to church with a bunch of people who look like us and hearing comforting messages every Sunday, or maybe being obsessed about our own sexual, sins, which is mostly what I think evangelical churches have done in my experience, and actually thinking more about the world, right, instead of just about ourselves. So I think there's a real opportunity here for something new. And goodness knows, if you look at young people today and their attitudes toward the white Christian churches, goodness knows we need something new because those folks are walking with their feet. I mean, today it's 4 in 10 Americans under the age of 30 who claim no religious affiliation. Like, they haven't, not just people who don't go to church, but are saying, like, I'm not going to claim any of these labels, Christian, Jewish, none of them, like a pox on all of it, right? 4 in 10. We've never seen a generation in their 20s that, really that distant from organized faith and religion. So I think there's a real opening here and a demand, right, that for accountability for white Christians to kind of stand up and take a deep self-examination and restock.
That's so good. Well, Robert P. Jones, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Disarming Leviathan. Where can our listeners find you and your work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, the research from Public Religion Research Institute is at prri.org. We have public opinion surveys at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics all the time coming out. You can find me writing weekly at my newsletter, which is at whitetolong.net. So it's on Substack. You can find it there. And, whatever, I'm actually trying these days more on Blue Sky and Threads than anywhere else. But we're all kind of confused right now about social media. But that's where I am on social media. But the book is available, Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. It's audiobook, Kindle, ebook. It's hardcover, all the versions you might want, pretty much wherever books are sold.
That's so good, man. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
All right. Thanks so much.